Here we have a picture that was posted to a group on debate, Torah, Talmud, and the Christian New Testament. I was invited to this group and have had a number of problems commenting on things, but yesterday I was able to comment on an individual's references to Muslims and references to the Quran as mandating that Muslims kill Jews. I was asked to come there and correct this individual, and I did so. I informed him that the Quran does not say that, and so he provided me some famous anti-Jewish polemic from late Hadith literature written centuries after Muhammad. I pointed out that to him, and he had quoted a passage from the Quran where it says to fight the kafirin. And by that, apparently, he felt that referred to Jews. Well, to be fair, some later Muslim authors would indeed say that it does, and that is, in fact, the view of the Wahhabiyya today and various extremist groups. So, okay. However, the Quran was not written by Wahhabis. The Quran was not even historically written by people who designated themselves under the title of Muslimin. We don't even see that become a designation for the community for centuries. Of course, the term is used in the Quran, but it's used in a far less formal way. It's used as a description. This is another language, of course, so people often turn words from other languages into titles, and people do this with ancient words too. When languages evolve, they'll take terms with sometimes obscure and sometimes unknown meanings, and they'll use them as if they were titles. But that's an issue unto itself. The point is, I informed him, that when it says kafirin, this is in fact referring to kofarim. Kofarim, or a kofar in Hebrew, like a kafir, is somebody who has apostated themselves. It's not simply a disbeliever, but a concealer. The root is exactly the same in both languages. Of course, Arabic and Hebrew are related languages. And the Arabic in the Quran, as many modern scholars of what Koren and Nevo call the revisionist school maintain, the Quran was not written in even classical Arabic. It was written in a regional dialect of Aramaic, and actually regional dialects of Aramaic, that we could probably be close to accurate in calling Arameo-Arabic. It's really not what we see as the standardized Arabic, and that also is an issue unto itself. Okay, so this video is actually going to be talking about Maimonides' Epistle to Yemen, and whether or not Maimonides himself wrote it in whole or in part, or whether or not it's pseudo-epigraphical in nature. It will also talk about some of the issues, the problematic issues therein. So, returning back to the point, this individual then responded, well, Maimonides said, and this is where the Epistle to Yemen comes in, that Muhammad is a madman. In fact, he called him Meshuggah. So Meshuggah is an interesting term for us to find Maimonides or pseudo-Maimonides using here. It's interesting because though the word was in use, and it definitely didn't have its later widespread usage that we find amongst Yiddishkeit, where it just becomes, this common word for a crazy person. It was used, indeed, for crazy individuals. We see it used in the Tanakh that way. We see in the Tanakh that David pretended to be Meshuggah. And we see that its root is also used in Hosea. So what have we here? In Hosea 9:7, the prophet says, "The days of visitation are come, the days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool, the madman of spirit is Meshuggah." So we see here, and of course, here's the example from 1 Samuel 21:14 through 16, of the term being used with regard to David fleeing to Gath and concealing his identity by acting like a crazy person. There's an interesting correlation here and between these about prophets acting Meshuggah and not actually being Meshuggah. So what is surprising is that we should find Maimonides using this term in so cavalier a manner when there are actually sort of interesting connotations Tanakhically to this term being used for prophets. That is, people viewing them as Meshuggah and them not actually being Meshuggah. So if someone as smart as Maimonides were using this term for Muhammad, it would be strange because he's sort of setting himself up for that rebuttal, that sort of rebuttal. Of course, nobody rebuts that, but he definitely would be setting himself up, and I wouldn't imagine that he would do that. However, there are numerous issues besides that really invalidate the Epistle to Yemen as an actual, authentic, complete work of Maimonides. Now, some scholars suggest that there was a Qur'an written by Maimonides and that it was then expanded upon, and all this other stuff was added that wasn't actually, from his pen and weren't actually his views. And I would say that that's at least possible, if not probable. In the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides says that Mashiach is not going to come as a miracle worker or supernatural sort of individual, and that people's expectations, along those lines are false. Now, we can imagine where they got these ideas from, since this is what Christianity had been telling everybody, and also what the Muslim world had absorbed from Christianity as well, going back even to the Umayyads, where they were employing individuals like John of Damascus, basically trying to tell them what the Quran meant. He's actually the origin of the first tafsir on the crucifixion passage in the Quran. Before his tafsir, it was not interpreted as it is popularly today. That's another story unto itself as well. However, this is a pretty big embarrassment if we're going to believe that the Epistle to Yemen was written authentically by Maimonides, as it appears today, as a complete work. Because in the Epistle to Yemen, it talks about Mashiach being a supernatural figure, and it endorses that view. So that passage, at least very clearly, could not have been written by Maimonides. While Maimonides does change his views as he gets older, and we do see things like that, there's absolutely no evidence that Maimonides held different views concerning the nature of Mashiach. And nobody believes that he did. So there's nobody actually advancing that. It's just simply that most people who quote this from the Epistle to Yemen haven't read the whole Epistle to Yemen, and when they have, they haven't been paying attention to these sort of faux pas of the author. Now, if you can, get to a library, university library with the Encyclopedia Judaica. It's an excellent resource. If you could get your, go to a university library, your synagogue might have it. If you could get it on DVD, whatever, cool, go for it. And do a little bit of reading about the Jewish community of Yemen at the time, and exclude anything that comes from the Epistle to Yemen, because this is a source that most people use in trying to extrapolate information. But this is as problematic as using something like the Sirah accounts to try to understand Muhammad's community. And I do have videos on that as well, on the Sirah account of Ibn Ishaq. Well, right here I don't have the Encyclopedia Judaica. However, I do have, and you all have, JewishEncyclopedia.com, which is great. Under the heading of literature, we read that the Yemenite Jews were not Talmudists. So let's highlight that. They were exposed to limited portions of the Talmud. But even here, they're sort of surprised a little bit to say that they had come under the influence of Maimonides. Now, they don't say it was impossible or anything like that. But it is surprising that non-Talmudists would be writing to Maimonides. And of course, we know that the Maskir root of the Himyarite kingdom, the mass conversion, was a Sadducean conversion. And we know from hadith sources that the opponents of Muhammad were people who had proselytized to the kingdom of Himyar. And thus we know that Muhammad's opponents were in fact Sadduceans. This is hugely important, and most people overlook this. However, because in fact the city of Medina, which was predominantly Jewish, according to every scholar writing on the subject, most of the city, well, first of all, the city invited Muhammad to be their leader. This would be unheard of if Muhammad was somehow contrary to the Jewish community, or had contrary views, or was not ruling in accordance with the Torah from the perception and perspective of the Jews of Medina. So what this means is that the majority of the Jews in Medina were not Sadducean, and they were not opponents of Muhammad, but there were some tribes that were Sadducean, and these would have been the ones that had proselytized to Himyar, the Himyarite kingdom, and so on and so forth. However, I find this to be interesting that they notice this, that they had somehow come under the influence of Maimonides, because we really shouldn't expect that for this community with very limited exposure even to the Talmud. So let's make it even more problematic. Okay, the individual that the Epistle to Yemen is written to, supposedly, is the son of Rabbi Natan'el ibn al-Fayyumi. Now, he was much more widely educated than many of the 3,000 or so Jews of Yemen in his day. He was a Neoplatonist, and like Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Bakuda, he was influenced by the Ikhwan as-Safa, a name pregnant with connotations of Sufism. And of course, Rabbeinu Bachya was a Judeo-Sufi. Yehuda ibn Tabon's translation of his Duties of the Heart is still required reading in the Orthodox yeshivot today. Well, Natan'el ibn al-Fayyumi said that Muhammad was a prophet to the nations, that he basically was teaching what today people call Noahidism, and also that his teachings did not conflict with Judaism and were neither intended to nor did they supersede nor abrogate the Torah and thus the mitzvot for Jews. This was not an unprecedented view, and actually this view of the rabbi did not get him in very much trouble at all. The Isawiya movement of Arabia and Persia became huge, according to some sources. According to some sources, it's implied that it was the second biggest form of Arabian Jewry. According to Karaite sources, this was absolutely an accepted group to the Rabbinites, and they held to rabbinic interpretations, to the Talmud, to the holidays of the Rabbinites, and so on, and thus the Isawiya or Isunim, according to the Judeo-Arabic version, intermarried with normative Rabbinites, and so on and so forth. It was actually the strictness of the community as well as persecutions from so-called Muslims that led to the disappearance of the community after between 300 and 1,000 years. Well, this is another issue, because some people suggest that one of the movement's leaders, the one who popularized the movement in revolt against the Abbasids, the newly formed Abbasid Caliphate, who was called Abu Isa, some people suggest that Maimonides also has a problem with him, and that he's correlating that individual in that movement with a movement in Yemen and denouncing it. Well, the problem is that Maimonides doesn't know the name of that individual, if he's writing this, right? So we should probably say pseudo-Maimonides. Doesn't know the name of that individual, doesn't know the name of that movement, a hugely popular movement. And he doesn't apparently know that there were 4 uprisings by different groups, all with somewhat similar character, before the actual Isawiya one, that the Isawiya one happened the last in the line of those, and that it's only after that we see the Abbasid Caliphate really sort of crack down, because they've had enough of these series of Jewish revolts against the Caliphate. And of course we see that the Caliphate cracked down on Muhammad's own family too, the al-Bayt, against Hussein, murdering him, murdering his infant son, and we see direct correlations between the Shia movement that grew out of what we could call al-Baytism, and or maybe Imamism, and the Isawiya. That also, again, is another issue unto itself. However, while I know a lot about this movement, and I can tell you a lot about it historically and religiously and all sorts, and while Karaite authors did, the author of the Epistle to Yemen did not. And that also leads us to believe that the author was not Maimonides. For one, if he was talking about that movement, he gets the time period all wrong, because he's talking about one of the preceding revolts that happened during the Umayyads. Now, we could say, okay, well, then he just wasn't talking about the Isawi, he was talking about one of those, preceding revolts. Well, that's entirely possible. What's not possible is that Maimonides himself, being an educated man, was talking about a very, very widely documented revolt that happened at the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate by an individual whose name was well known, whose names were well known, rather. And if he was referring to that, it would be surprising that he didn't refer to the revolutionary climate leading up to it, and thus the 4 preceding revolutions during the time period which he cites. Okay, that might be a little over some people's knowledge of history in the region, but there's going to be other people that actually does speak to. So we've noticed here a lot of issues. And on top of that, of course, there's the references to the sort of yeah, we killed Jesus and he deserved to die sort of crap, and this isn't really consistent with what we see from Maimonides elsewhere either. But it's somewhat irrelevant to the issue at hand, but it's not the sort of attitude that we wouldn't expect. I just used a double negative there. But it's let's put it this way: it's the sort of attitude that was not uncommon. I'm really liking the double negatives right now. It was not uncommon amongst different Arabian Jewish communities, and in fact, that's what the Quran was addressing. That Jews are boasting about saying that they killed Jesus, but it is not true. Jews, the Quran says, neither killed nor even crucified Jesus. It was only made to look that way. So John of Damascus is the one who then says that this means there was some switcheroo, blah, blah, blah. John of Damascus was, of course, a Christian, and he was, explaining it this way so as to belittle the Quran to his congregants and people who read stuff that he wrote. And he literally convinced the Umayyads of this, that this is what the Quran meant. And it's tragic because in the plain reading of the Quranic Arabic, it's absolutely clear what it's saying. So translations you read will always butcher this, but the Arabic is very clear. And if you stick to the grammar, it's very clear what's being said. So there's that issue. And then there's also the other issue that if Maimonides is saying all this stuff, not just about Muhammad, but also about Arabs. So in general, let's go back to here. He says, the Arabs have persecuted us severely and passed baneful discriminatory legislation against us. Never did a nation molest, degrade, debase, and hate us as much as they, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is something we can imagine is coming from the pen of a Yemenite facing Zaidi persecution, forced conversions, and so on. But it's very difficult to believe that Maimonides is writing this when he was in the employ, not only as the physician, but the personal advisor of Salahuddin. I mean, Salahuddin, this is not like he worked for an Arab. He worked for Salahuddin. And he's going to be saying this about Arabs have persecuted us. I mean, this clearly wasn't his view. If anyone knows anything about history, and anyone knows anything about his relationship to Salahuddin, and he treated Muslims continuously. He was expelled from, his family fled Andalusia, but this was a Berber group that had moved in, and his whatever views he had towards them, it certainly did not impact his views about all Arabs in general. We absolutely know that for a fact. Nobody was forcing him to work for Salahuddin, and in fact he turned down an offer to work for King Richard, the so-called Lionheart. He was on the side of Salahuddin. So the fact that we're being told that this is a quote from him, that these are his words, really it's only something that we can believe if we don't know much about history. And we don't know much about the actual biography of Maimonides. We don't know what was going on in his life, who he was working for, people he treated, his defense of the absolute monotheism of Muslims, and his response to Ovadia, the proselyte. And it also, here's another problem, his own son, Rabbeinu Avraham, and then his sons, David and Ovadia, different Ovadia, were Judeo-Sufis like Rabbeinu Bahia, and they wrote extensively about it. Maimonides' own son was, he led the Egyptian Jewish community in Salat, and said he reclaimed it, and he said, you shouldn't be offended if people compare you to Sufis, because the Sufis are practicing the path of the prophets. They're walking the path of the prophets. The prophets aren't walking their path. In other words, they're walking the path of the prophets, and that it's actually the iniquity of Israel in his day that these things were viewed by people outside of his community as controversial. because these were authentic Jewish teachings and practices which can be found in the Tanakh itself. So it's strange that no one would have said, hey, Rabbeinu Avraham, your dad said, though, this, and it's strange that Maimonides wouldn't have said to the son of the man who said that Muhammad was a prophet to the nations, etc., that he wouldn't have brought that up. Your father was misguided, blah, blah, blah. Now you see that your father's misguided, blah, blah, blah. There's no reference to that. In actuality, I'll leave you with my concluding hypothesis. The Epistle to Yemen was written by individuals later trying to revise history in Yemen once the Yemenite community became more calibrated to Talmudic Judaism. They were trying to sort of scrub their history, and in fact, the son of Rabbi Natan'el ibn al-Fayyumi, to whom the epistle was supposedly written, was probably involved in some sort of movement which the epistle describes. The epistle was probably not written to him at all. He was probably one of the perpetrators that the later revisionists had a problem with, and I mean revisionist in certainly a different sense than we use it when we talk about historiography. I mean it in the sense that he was actually changing history, not revising his historiographical approach. But yes, in the same way that we see with Ibn Ishaq and the Sirah account with regards to Muhammad, there's a need to sort of scrub. With Ibn Ishaq, he's trying to scrub the Jewishness of Muhammad, to disassociate the Jewishness of Muhammad's movement from Jewry and Judaism, to distance itself under the Abbasid direction and influence, to create a permanent and lasting rift. Again, another issue unto itself. However, this is a common theme in how history gets written, how it gets written inaccurately, and how it gets written with political biases directing it and sort of encoded within it. So in the same way, the Yemenite community would have been trying to make this individual try to distance himself from his pluralistic and quasi-Islamic roots, in the same way that Ibn Ishaq did with Muhammad. Whoever is the pseudo-epigraphical author of this letter would have been trying to do that with Ibn Natan'el. I say this because it's simply inconceivable that his father wouldn't have come up and that the beliefs of his father would not have come up in this letter if it was written to Ibn Natan'el. It's just absolutely inconceivable. But again, most people don't know this stuff. Most people, when they read the epistle, and certainly people when they just copy and paste a select quote from it on the internet, simply don't know the background of this and of the individuals involved